It is Monday, January 12th, and it's getting pretty late with Jake Landau. Welcome back, folks, to season two. It is great to have you on the show with me again. I am very much looking forward to getting things back rolling. We have a great guest for you, good enough to flex you to Monday instead of Sunday. His name is Jason Toney. He is the director of media advocacy, who runs the Media Accountability Project for Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East. And he is also one of the co editors of the essay collection book When Genocide Wasn't News, published by Breach Media. Jason, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
No, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Obviously, one of the big things and one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show is part of what CJPME, Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, does. You're the director of media advocacy, and as I said, you run the Media Accountability Project. I was wondering if you could run over a little for people what exactly that does.
Yeah, so Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East launched the Media Accountability Project in 2023, early 2023. And it's been
So a
described
few
by
months
some of my,
before October 7th.
yes, exactly. I joined the team in February, right around when the project was launched. So I
More
had
than a
from
few months,
February.
then.
Yeah, so from February to October, we were dealing a lot with Jenin in the West Bank, and that was our primary focus in the lead up to October 7th. But obviously, October 7th changed everything. But
Right.
it, the map, as we call it for short, one of my good friends has described it as the progressive FLAC machine. So we write to journalists every day expressing uh, disappointment, concern, alarm, or appreciation for news authored in Canada um, about Palestine or anything related to it. And we send out media alerts to volunteers. We will work also very closely with a number of volunteers who are part of our daily meetings where we organize together to find the best and the worst articles to respond to across Canadian media apparatus. And yeah, it's been a challenging time running the project. There's been plenty of impacts, but impact is always going to be limited by the nature of the structure of media in Canada. So we can talk more about that. But yeah, that's generally the map and what we do in a very broad sense.
So, in a simplified way to explain it, look at what stories that are being reported in the media, and when there's something that you feel has a pro-Israel bias to it, you uh, you write to the ombudsperson at that publication. Uh, is that an accurate way to describe it?
Sure, that's the gist of it. I mean, there's a lot of other projects that we take on and some other tools that we have in our belt for tackling violations of journalistic standards. Like sometimes we will raise issues with media accountability offices in Canada. So you have the National News Media Council, which has a number of newspapers that are members, and if there's a violation of journalistic standards, you can complain to the National News Media Council, and they'll adjudicate between you and the newspaper to see if there's a resolution that's required. You also have the Quebec Press Council, which deals with any media that appears in Quebec, and you have the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council, which deals with any broadcast media in Canada. But unfortunately, for better or worse, uh, the journalism is an unregulated industry in Canada. So any of these accountability bodies, they're all voluntary in
Right.
terms of participation.
And I'm aware of this and that I'm only bound by the rules of the organizations that I am participating in. I'm a member of the Canadian Freelancers Union, so I am bound by the rules of our organization. But I am not a member currently of the Canadian Association of Journalists, so I am not bound by the rules of that organization. And uh, the voluntary nature of this is a problem. And there is an argument to be made, perhaps, for whether or not this should be a self regulating profession. But also, there's a counter argument, perhaps, that who exactly would get the authority to decide? Are there not problems with being able to limit who can and cannot be a journalist?
Yeah, certainly. I think you've identified one of the big struggles in the work that I do is navigating these questions. I would say just to put this in here and on the record because I like to do this. I'm extremely disappointed by the work of the Canadian Association of Journalists. They are the body primarily responsible for laying out the journalistic standards and ethics that journalists should abide by for the most part in Canada. Most media outlets rely on the CAJ's ethics guidelines for determining violations and such. But the CAJ has been extraordinarily weak when it comes to standing up for Palestinian journalists and for journalists who are facing retribution for trying to report critically on Israel or Palestine. So I think the CAJ has been a rather disappointing organization. I don't think it adds an enormous amount of value to journalists in Canada, and I think it's an institution that more journalists ought to move away from. And I think the problem of journalism in Canada is we have a predominantly corporate-owned media that is very glad to appease the interests of its market of other corporations,
Right.
whether it's the
New,
companies that own
news
them or
media
the
in Canada
advertisers.
is, at least on radio and on television, is mainly Rogers, Bell, Chorus, or CBC if you're like me.
Yeah, and then you also have the six-headed hydra of Post Media
Yeah, it's
or
like
Chatham Asset Managers.
yeah, I like to point out to people that Post Media is owned by a pro-Trump United States hedge fund owned by United States citizens who financially support the Trump regime through donations to the Republican Party. So there is certainly a conflict there, and it would be absurd to say there is not a conflict there.
Yeah, and I'd add one more layer to that, not to get too tangential, but I think these are important points to start off our conversation with.
We're an hour-long
Post Media,
podcast. We can afford a
yeah,
tangent or two.
there we go. So Post Media not only has the ownership structure that you've described, but when it comes to the National News Media Council, the body that's supposed to adjudicate between readers and newspapers that I described to you earlier, about 20% of the members of the NNC, the National News Media Council, 20% of the members of the NNC are Post Media owned
Oh, they get more
publications.
than one vote.
They so they're paying to be members of the NNC. So they're paying somebody to hold them accountable. So the system works exactly as it is designed, which is to say that Post Media is very rarely, if ever, held to account.
No,
I mean, we have
but just to go back to what you said, it's not just one vote for Post Media. It's a vote for every paper they own that's a member.
yes, so every
That's
single paper
absurd.
that they own is a member. Now, the way that it works is there aren't typically, as far as I'm aware, there aren't votes being cast in general within the NNC. There is a board who adjudicates the issues. So there's actually a number of professional members who play a role on the council and participate in the votes of the decision. But not every single newspaper has its own vote. So it's a more concentrated number. But there are like Rob Roberts, the editor for the National Post, is a professional member of the NNC, meaning he has significant influence on its operations and how it makes its decisions. And further, when you have 20% of newspapers that are members of this thing are owned by the same company, it's very unlikely that this organization is going to want to bother them and actually hold them to account, because God forbid they actually get firm and do something about the mass propaganda machine that Post Media oversees. They would have to dissolve if they lost Post Media. I mean, they probably wouldn't be able to exist. They wouldn't be able to sustain themselves. And keep in mind, we have essentially tabloids like the Toronto Sun, which are far right
And
outlets as far
tabloid
as
in
I'm
the very
concerned.
literal sense, in that they still have sunshine girls. Mind you, all the photos were still taken 5 years. There was a piece on this in the Trillium, which I think everyone should read, where they've actually just been reusing old photos of women who are long since out of college or university age and are like, we never thought they would be re-shown to people. Please stop. To which Post Media is
Wow,
like, haha, no. Uh,
wow,
yeah,
wow.
fun group of chuckle fucks over there.
Yeah, well said. But
Yeah,
yeah, I mean, the fact that you have Toronto Sun as a member of the NNC, and they actually, Toronto Sun and National Post, most of the complaints, not most, but a significant portion of the complaints that the NNC deals with are against these organizations, and they've lost several times. But nonetheless, there's no real accountability there. There's no there. I mean, occasionally they have to publish the decision of the NNC in their newspaper, which is once in a blue moon.
I
So
saw
anyway,
something
all this
similar
to say that.
with the media accountability project you guys run, where there was recently a ruling by the Quebec Press Council on the Canadian Jewish news.
Yeah, we had two wins in the Quebec Press Council. The Quebec Press Council is different. It doesn't operate in the same way as the NNC. The NNC has paying member publications to sustain itself. The Quebec Press Council does not have the same structure. They tend to be, in our view, much stronger. They'll rule, they don't care who's a member and who's not a member. If the media appears in Quebec, they'll deal with it. So we won two cases recently, one against the Canadian Jewish News and another against the Suburban, both for their misrepresentations about different issues in articles. So that's pretty significant. We submitted those complaints, almost a year ago. So these things take a lot of time. But yeah,
And
that's
the lack
a
of time is itself shows it isn't a very strong process, even for this stronger organization, because that's a year in which a misleading story is out there.
absolutely.
Yeah. But so where exactly does the Quebec Press Council get funding from if they don't have newspapers voluntarily paying in?
Now, so I can't give you a satisfactory answer on this because the Quebec Press Council and our complaints to them, I mean, we've just made, I think, two complaints.
Mm.
Whereas with the NNC, we've made dozens and dozens.
Right, and
So
it's
I
a
am
different
less
organization
familiar.
from yours. Like, which
Yeah,
which is
yeah.
fair. But one thing, how exactly do they bind papers to publish their decision?
So it's interesting, actually. For anyone who's interested could read a lot more about this. There was a court case between the Quebec Press Council and the Journal de Montréal. The Quebec Press Council took a complaint about the Journal de Montréal for a false claim in their newspaper. They released a public decision. They demanded that the Journal de Montréal publish the decision in their newspaper. The Journal refused. There was a court case about this. Um, I don't have all of the details of exactly what happened top of mind, but effectively the Quebec Press Council won, and they are able to act as a sort of public adjudicator of these issues, even if newspapers don't want anything to do with
So
them.
just
So
through fiat, the courts managed to say, well, they seem to be regulating it good enough. We've decided you should have to listen to their decisions. That I don't say that in a bad way. That honestly just seems kind of incredible to me. Like I appreciate it nonetheless that they're not beholden to the group they have to regulate because that obviously creates problems. But it's interesting in that it didn't appear to come from a specific like bill of the National Assembly.
Yeah, I'd invite anybody to look into the details. It was big news many years
I
ago,
will
and there's
also
lots of
look into the
articles written about
details.
it.
This is
Yeah,
very
I don't
interesting to
have,
me. Yeah,
like I said, I don't have
it's
them
a tangent.
exactly top of
Yeah.
mind. Yes, yes,
But
yes.
it's a more powerful tool that's in the Media Accountability Project's toolbox. And I believe in the case of the Canadian Jewish News, there was a misrepresentation of the pro-Palestinian demonstration as being fundamentally anti-Semitic in nature. I think there was a single individual who did do something anti-Semitic, but it was characterized as representing the whole of the protest, which was materially untrue.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah, they effectively, in short, they described Palestine protesters as Nazis, and
yeah,
acted as if this is some very common incident. And there's lots of people doing Nazi salutes, and that's obviously untrue. So they lost.
this is always
The
a funny
CJN lost.
assert. Yeah, this is an assertion made very, very generally and commonly in the Jewish community in Canada right now. And as a Canadian Jew, I don't really get it. But to be fair, from my personal experience, when I went to the UFT encampment the other year, I was welcomed in, and they're like, "Oh, we're doing Shabbat. You want challah?" And I'm like, "Sure." Yeah. And I'm like, these are the anti-Semites I was warned about. They're doing Shabbat with me, and they've got the prayers and stuff written in Hebrew in the right direction. like they're doing better than most of the white people. Yeah, but you get my point. It's like obviously I'm much more on the pro-Palestine side. I think Israel is committing a genocide, and I think that based on the plainly observable facts in front of me. Uh, but to be fair, I do have to question when it comes to the project that you run. How do you distinguish between what you see as pro-Israel bias and just what is a fact that may not be beneficial to the pro-Palestinian stance?
Yeah, we have a number of different frameworks to break down articles and understand where pro-Israel bias might enter. So to give you some examples of what that might look like is one thing that we'll look for is we'll refer to this as prejudicial placement of a viewpoint. So first of all, the question is there a Palestinian perspective in an article about Palestine or Israel? And if there is, because if there isn't, first of all, that's malpractice. There should be, and second of all, if there is, where is it in the article? Quite often, what we see is Palestinian perspectives, if they're included at all, are buried at the end of an article, and that's something we see repeatedly. Another thing that we'll look for is the use of active versus passive voice. So, passive voice is a really good way to water down the actions of Israel. So, rather than talking about how Israel has killed, X number of, children or whatever the statistic might be, or how Israel has bombed such and such a place in Gaza.
They'll say stuff
Um,
like bullets were fired into.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And I'm like, who
Or just
fired the bullets? Ghosts?
yeah, and just or just that Palestinians have died, and we
Yeah.
don't know who killed them. We don't know how many. We don't know anything about the demographics. We don't have any of the context. So
It
that's
was the
another way. And
rapture.
so context is like a hugely important thing that we're looking for as well. So sometimes we'll see stories about Gaza that fail to mention any of the broader context of what's going on. So there'll be sometimes we'll actually see they cite, the reason they give for why things are happening in Gaza. So they'll talk about October 7th and what happened, and they'll give
And that's
an exact death
and
toll
that
with all
struck
kinds of
out to me
details.
because I know statistically was before October 7th, wasn't there an article published on October 6th saying that it had been the deadliest year for Palestinian children to date?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I believe that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Did that come from DCIP, the Defense of Children International Palestine?
Yeah, so it's like it's not like this is new. The
Yeah.
reason that there's violence is that Israel has been doing this for many decades.
Yeah, of course. Of course.
Yeah. But I
Yeah.
guess what you're saying is that like you have a few different like heuristics you use, and when a bunch of them or even some of them ping at once, it's like a hint in a certain direction. Like you obviously can't always glean intent from something someone's written, but there are certain red flags that pop up and tell you this isn't right.
Yeah, certainly. And personally, I'm not even particularly concerned about the question of intent. I mean, quite often the reason these journalists are working at, these agenda setting newspapers is exactly because they've been conditioned to write in a way that satisfies the interests of the powerful, and they've arrived into these positions of power just kind of being obedient and serving these
Conscious
interests.
intent doesn't matter as much as publishing what's actually true.
Yes, and we'll get a lot of furious messages from journalists who are very upset that we're accusing them of bias. But the reality is there's rather objective methods we can use to analyze this stuff, and over time the bias is absolutely undeniable. I mean, there's really no question here. You have organizations who try to flip the whole thing on its head, like Honest Reporting Canada, and pretend that the opposite is true. But I think anyone who looks at this stuff with a sober mind will come away with a pretty clear view. Um,
And for
yeah,
context, Honest Reporting Canada, folks, they do not want honest reporting. They want pro-Israel reporting. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's Orwellian name.
Yeah, it's interesting, and like I certainly don't appreciate what they're doing. I understand why journalists may react emotionally to this suggestion that they have a bias. What I would tell them is that I know I have a bias of my own. That's why I explicitly tell it to my readers. That's why I'm an opinion writer, because I'm wearing my bias on my sleeve and I want you to be biased along with me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was Robert Fisk who said we should be biased on the side of suffering or something of that nature. I'm sort
Oh
of
yeah, there
paraphrasing, but
between Elie Wiesel said like there's no neutrality between oppressor and the oppressed because it benefits the oppressor. I wish he felt the same way about Palestinians, but no one's perfect. Like although, like it's funny if you read like his third book in the Night trilogy, like he's very much like criticizing militant Zionism. Uh, so I don't know what happened to him later. It's
yeah,
none a different conversation, but one thing I did want to get into that's very it's not exactly tangential. It runs very parallel to your work for CJPME. Is You also co-edited a book with as I mentioned in your intro with the Breach Media called "When Genocide Wasn't News." And I was wondering if you could talk about the collection of essays and analysis that you and your co-editors collected for us.
yeah. So when genocide wasn't news, is anthology put together by myself, Danya Majid, who's a lawyer and runs the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association, as well as Martin Lukács, who runs the Breach Media. And we came together because we felt there was no real systematic documentation of the very clear evidence of bias and what we considered a cover up of the genocide in Palestine. So we came together and we tried to put it all together. So we collected what we thought were the most important pieces since the genocide that document this bias in various ways, as well as a couple of pieces that came out before the genocide, that show kind of the lead up as to like why Canada and its media was so primed to do a bad job covering what was happening in Gaza. And so I think it's been a very well received collection. We've sold over 2,000 copies now. I think it has played a role in shaping how a lot of people think about media coverage of Palestine in Canada, and I think it really lays bare the complicity that Canadian media has in the genocide in Gaza. And it does this in a number of ways. I mean, it collects data. There's organizations like Tech for Palestine that have created tools for us to actually analyze um, various aspects of articles using data collection. And there's a bunch of different computer science tools that are employed in the analysis of things like how Palestinians are talked about when they're killed versus Israelis, things of that nature. But
Yeah,
then we
I'm
also got a
familiar
bunch of
with that kind of algorithm. With it's a useful way to use large language models that isn't plagiarizing artists. I think it's called sentiment analysis.
well, there is some degree of that, but actually there's some degree of that in the map, but the stuff that's in the book is much less that. It's we'd be going down a huge rabbit hole to get into all of the computer science that lays under it, but it's not exactly sentiment analysis. There's nothing that we did that relied on AI or LLMs. It's a much narrower way of analyzing information that use some different tools. There's a computer scientist, I believe her name is Holly Jackson, who did a bunch of the coding that opened up some of the doors for this for the breach. And a lot of the code that's out there is publicly available, but it involves scraping the articles from websites and analyzing. There's a huge human element to this, the different ways that these things are spoken about, but it's a little bit of a different process. But with all of that said, one of the things we also do in the book that I think is really important is we collect the stories from journalists who are blowing the whistle on what's going on behind the scenes in newsrooms, because there are some dramatic incidents that have happened in newsrooms with some important journalists were fired for raising questions. There's all sorts of things of that nature. So the book, I think, presents a pretty wide view of all the reasons why coverage of Palestine in Canada is the way it is.
Right. Like for one, like there's a mandate in a lot of Canadian newsrooms that you have to say Gazan instead of Palestinian.
Yeah, much less to ever say the word Palestine.
Yeah.
Even still after the statehood recognition, we still see a huge hesitation around that.
Well, because they understand we just recognized a Bantustan, like we didn't recognize a real state because we don't think they should have a military or sovereignty over their own land.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I don't mean that to be derisive to Palestine. I mean that in many ways, like many of the Palestinians I talk to see the Mahmoud Abbas's government as essentially a puppet that is way too collaborative with Israeli military, their security forces.
Yeah, I mean, without even going into the those kinds of politics, I think fundamentally, like what Canada is doing is it's recognizing a state, but not recognizing Palestinian self-determination. So it's not really the recognition of a state in any meaningful sense, as far as I'm concerned.
Recognizing
And
a vassal state.
yeah, and I think CJPME has tried to toe the line because there are a lot of people who support our work and support what we do who consider this a win, and I'm very sympathetic to that
I
view. I
get that.
understand where they're coming from.
I
Uh,
admittedly there's parts of me that do understand how it is a win, but I'm always the guy who's saying this isn't enough. We need action, not words. Please stop selling Israel weapons.
yeah, and I think fundamentally for us at CJPME, it doesn't change our work in any meaningful sense. I think our goals are the same, our mission is the same, and perhaps if we ever did advocate for recognition of a Palestinian state, now we don't do that, but that was never, I think, what Palestinians, from our perspective, were like overwhelmingly demanding.
No, they're
Just the
demanding material things.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Well, It's okay. So, folks, this has been a great first half with our guest, Jason Toney from Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East and the co editor of the anthology collection, When Justice Genocide Wasn't News. We will come back to you shortly after the break with our 3 headline topics of the week. See you in a sec. Today's episode of It's Getting Pretty Late with Jake Landau is brought to you by me. Folks, all of my work is available for free with no paywall at jakelandau.ca. But in order to keep writing and recording, I need money, because money is what makes this show go round. So, if you enjoy my content or find it informative, please consider a paid subscription at jakelandau.ca/subscribe. And please leave a 5-star rating on the show in your favorite podcast app, be it Apple, Spotify, or a secret third thing. Thank you, and enjoy the show. And we are back from the break with our guest Jason Toney from CJPME and our 3 headline topics of the week. First headline topic from CBC News, written by Erica Johnson and Anna Komnick. Government documents suggest Ottawa's stalled airline fee meant to fund passenger complaint system. Records show Transport Canada and transport ministers trying to delay fee implementation. Internal government documents obtained by Go Public, a CBC accountability program where they suggest that Transport Canada officials and successive transport ministers worked to delay an effort to force airlines to help pay for the air passenger complaint system. As many of you know, a few years ago, there was a new program put into place in Canada by the Ministry of Transportation through a law passed through Parliament, which means it is supposed to be placed into effect as law, that would allow you to file complaints for flight delays or for such and be refunded, as you should be. Unfortunately, the system is incredibly backlogged, and it can take over a year, if not more, to get your complaints resolved, which is a long time for the airline to hold on to your money if they're in the wrong. Because it's, again, very underfunded. And documents the CBC has uncovered show that it is underfunded, apparently because, despite it being part of the law that there would be a fee charged to cover this and fund this, the airlines lobbied the transport minister, and there is a letter from Anita Anand saying she has not been consulted with, and that they need to refrain from implementing any decision on the fee until they have adequately consulted with her. But the funny thing here, Jason, is that consulting with her is completely unnecessary. The law has been passed by Parliament. It has received royal assent. It has reached the coming into force date. You have no power to stop it as an individual minister. So, first question of the back half. Do you think this is appropriate?
Yeah, I think this situation really shows you how little somebody like Anita Anand thinks of ordinary Canadians. I mean, the excuse is so laughable of why this is being delayed. It's totally absurd. I think that it's pretty obvious, pretty naked what's happening. They're just gladly delaying for the airlines and effectively giving them a subsidy. And perhaps one day the delay will be over and they'll have to bite the bullet, probably for a lower fee. But we're effectively, as taxpayers, subsidizing these airlines so longer they don't have to pay these fees.
Now, I'm trying to look up the exact date here right now, but okay. It looks like the federal government sold their stake in Air Canada in December of 2024, which means that at the time when this letter from Anita Anand was written to the chair of the Canadian Transport Association in October 2024, that she was arguing on behalf of the financial interests of the government, which partially owned Air Canada and, of course, did not want. So, do you see this as a problem with partial nationalization? That the company, or do you think that conflict of interest would still exist even if Air Canada was fully a crown corporation?
Yeah, I think it would exist either way, as far as I can tell. But certainly that um, that situation plays a dynamic, likely behind the scenes, in how this is playing out, that we don't have all the details of. But certainly the timing of everything is conspicuous.
Hmm. And it's just you're right, it is frustrating because there there should be a fee, because how else are you going to fund it? Like the I mean, unless you're suggesting it should be funded out of general tax revenue, but consumer groups largely supported the fee. Airlines opposed the fee, saying it would incentivize frivolous claims and that passengers should so to be clear to folks, passengers are not the one being feed. Airlines are the ones paying the fee.
Hmm. Hmm.
like, because passengers should not have to pay if their complaint is fair. In fact, in a normal court case, instead of tribunals, and I would note we set up tribunals to not have to give people the same rights they have in a court, and that's a whole other ball game to complain about. But in a normal courtroom, if you win and you're determined in the right, you can pursue costs in a lot of cases. Like, if the airline delays your flight and does something wrong, you should not have to pay a fee for getting your money back. They should pay the fee because they did something wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a Kafka-esque situation where it's total nonsense and there's no justification for it. It's just so clear what is happening here, that the lobbying of these airlines is paying off. I mean, the amount of lobbying they've done in Parliament is massive. And it seems that Canada wants to keep the profits of these airlines up, and doesn't seem particularly concerned about the idea of Canadian taxpayers or passengers having to pay more in the meantime.
Well, I mean, they don't seem to care about the cost of anything going up. They see that as good for the market. Like the and to be fair, maybe it is good for the market to extract every ounce of wealth out of everyone except the 1%. Like drawing until at some point though, you will be drawing blood from a stone. We cannot all be serfs. I mean, I know you may want us all to be your serfs, rich people, but you do in fact need people who can buy your products. You can't only have luxury goods. That's not how economics. Like all the successful countries have a strong middle class. China is doing well now because they have a stronger middle class, the kind that the United States used to have. It's just, and like on you're right on the legal front as well. Paul Daly, who's a research chair in administrative law and governance at the University of Ottawa, said Anand's position was spurious and constitutionally inappropriate, which is this for an academic. Those are bold words.
Yeah, 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 yeah. For an academic, they are. Yeah.
Yeah, but like it's now, mind you, Anita Anand isn't transport minister anymore. That is, or was, Chrystia Freeland, who says that the well, what here's what happened, folks. The CTA chair wrote to Freeland saying, "Hey, new minister, we're ready to proceed now." However, what happened next is unclear because new documents stop at that point, because that's when the CBC filed their request. And that's a good argument here for one problem with freedom of information laws in Canada. The CBC filed a request in May 2025 and only got them in December 2025, at which point they prepared this report to come out today.
Mhm.
So yeah, the accountability problems go all the way down. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, those are important details in this story for sure.
it's okay though. I trust these people to regulate WestJet when they want to pack us in like cattle with legs that no longer fit if you're above 5'6". Like
Yes.
they have that kind of cramped leg room on like Japanese domestic airlines, but to be fair, they have a shorter height, so average height, so it's more comfortable. Like you can't do that in like the fjords where people are on average like 6 feet. They'll die.
Yeah, I think at some point we're just gonna have like a back pad. So we're gonna stand and you're just gonna kind of lean back a few inches so they can fit as many people as possible.
I've seen at airline tech and engineering conferences, I've seen seat models for standing seats, and it terrified me. I'm like, and everyone mocks me for wanting to take Via Rail instead. I'm taking Air Canada tomorrow because I have to go to Calgary, and there's no more Via Rail service to Calgary since the 1990s. Thank you, federal government. Yeah. Well, this is going to keep getting worse. Moving on.
Yes. Yeah.
Moving on to our second topic of the day. From Global News from Prisha Dev, Carney condemns Iran crackdown as protests near 2-week mark. The Canadian federal government is criticizing the government of Iran, the Ayatollah and his regime, for using violent force against protesters in their country. Now, my question of the day for you, Jason, and this is our question of the week for pointing out the obvious. Uh, for the no prize, do you think that Carney should criticize all countries that use lethal force against protesters?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Congratulations. That is the
Yeah.
correct
Woohoo.
answer. Congrats
Yeah.
on your no prize for pointing out the obvious.
Yeah. I mean, it's so laughable
Yeah,
the kinds
it's
of
remarkable.
excuses they. Yeah.
Like he's
Yeah.
saying this meanwhile, like ICE is down south shooting like moms in the head on their way to pick up kids from school. Uh, and meanwhile, what are we doing in Canada? We're not just idly refusing to criticize it. We're selling armored trucks to ICE to help them kidnap more people and send them to the concentration camps like Alligator Alcatraz or CCOT over in El Salvador. Like it's laughable. You're right. It is laughable that we treat Iran like, and you know what? The Ayatollah is an authoritarian who is brutal to his people. This is correct. That doesn't mean I want the Shah, who is also an authoritarian who is brutal to his people. And it doesn't mean that you only criticize it when they're on your political side. You get what I mean?
Yeah, of course, of course. I mean, you don't see these kinds of condemnations coming for, other countries that are chronic human rights abusers that we've cozied up with because it just
Israel.
has nothing to do with human. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I mean, you have Saudi Arabia that Canada has been very glad to cozy up with
Oh,
in
of course.
various ways.
And the
And there's no mention
Emirates and all of these countries, like
for sure, for sure.
there are so many like petty authoritarian regimes, and it's become very blatant, especially with Venezuela, how it isn't whether they're authoritarian, it's whether they're pro United States or anti United States.
Yeah. And I think it should be clear to anyone listening to this that it sounds like neither you nor I are particularly friendly with the current Iranian government. That's
No.
not what's being said here. but
I don't
what
want
is
women to
being
be
said.
forced at gunpoint to wear a hijab. I want it to be their choice. At the same time, I don't want a Yankee puppet installed who will suddenly make them have open relationships with Israel, something the mass majority of the population also doesn't want. The revolution against the
Yeah.
Shah was a good thing. The Shah was installed by the United States and the United Kingdom in the 50s to replace the elected democratic socialist government in Iran. Uh, the problem was that the revolution in 79 was co opted by the Islamist faction against the will of the Iranian majority. It's complex, and there was a piece recently in the Globe and Mail by Samira Moyadeen, who I've had on the show previously and is a friend of mine, where she's essentially saying that they deserve better, these protesters, than to have their movement immediately co-opted by these Western shitheads.
Yeah, of course, and I think that's clearly right, and I think part of the hypocrisy of Carney's statement is that Canada's played its important role for the last many decades in the destabilization and the economic hardship that's going on in Iran right now. I mean, Canada has been on board with many of the U.S.'s actions, since the CIA overthrew the government in the 50s,
We've been a very
and it's
content
participated
vassal
in,
state. We're
for
not
sure.
upset that about the imperialism or the colonialism. We're upset that now we're being treated the way we've treated every other country at America's behest.
Yeah, and they'll be very glad to have Iran if they can make it this way as a client state again, to pull back the sanctions and accomplish all kinds of
Especially
other
because
extractive.
Iran is able to sell some pretty advanced military technology to countries like North Korea, to Russia, because, like, if I remember correctly, there was a drone they managed to capture through jamming the controls. And land it safely, and then they took it apart, and now they have like two drone models that are essentially like a one for one clone, but with their own computer system. So, and
Mhm.
I know they've sold a bunch of those to I know a lot of Iranian weapons like that have ended up in Russia's hands during the war in Ukraine. So like there's definitely reasons that the United States would want to take such products off the table.
Yeah, yeah, of course, and just I think this conversation started. The kind of basis is media accountability. Notice how in this article there's really no mention of the many waves of sanctions that Canada has launched against Iran that have played its role in destabilizing the economy and harming ordinary Iranians. There's no mention of Canada adding the IRGC, am I getting the acronym right, to its terror list. All of this is sort of absent. It's important that people understand the history here, so they can better understand that this none of this is about human rights,
Right.
in terms of the
Because
Carney
if we were
government's
to add the
policy.
IRGC to the terror list, then surely we must also add ICE to the terror list.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Like,
yeah. And the
surely
list.
we must add the IDF to the terror list.
Right. I
Uh,
mean, the terror list is, I think it's just it's a political tool. It has nothing to do with security.
right.
It's
If it's fine, there are some countries and entities that do deserve sanctions. I'm not completely naive in that regard. You don't need something like the terror list to do that. You just sanction people worth sanctioning in the way that is appropriate to sanction.
yeah,
Now,
yeah,
easier said than done, but like it should be finely tuned sanctions to whoever you're sanctioning, because not every situation is the same.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, hopefully the time will come where the Canadian government lifts a single finger, much less an elbow, up against the United States. But that time is not now under Governor Carney. Not now. All right.
Yeah.
Moving on to our final topic of the day, folks, and this is our local story. And Jason, since CJPME is based in Montreal, we are going with a Montreal story. And also, I believe you have a book about municipal politics that you also an anthology that you collected.
Yeah.
As I'm, we'll get your title of that book in a sec, but I'll read the headline here first from the Montreal Gazette by Jesse Feith. Montreal budget highlights: property taxes up, major investments to fight homelessness. Mayor Soraya Martinez Ferrada says her first budget marks a significant shift in Montreal's priorities. So, yeah, the city of Montreal has presented its 2026 budget on Monday, the first under the new mayor, Soraya Martinez Ferrada, as I've just said. It's about it's a modest increase. Property taxes will go up by about 3.8% versus last year's 2.2% hike. The average commercial tax bill will rise by about 3.4%. As someone from Toronto, these feel like fairly modest numbers to me. Of course, we'll get your perspective on that in a second. But it seems that many of the focuses in this government are on major complaints, things like housing, public security, homelessness. But I'm wondering, as someone who's obviously edited a large book on this, in a general topic of municipal government, I'd love to get your thoughts on this, Jason.
Yeah, so I think it was 2019, I published a book called Take the City: Voices of Radical Municipalism. And housing, I think, was one of the major themes, which is the most important, I think, aspect of this story in the budget that Montreal passed. And when it comes to the increase in property taxes, keep in mind that there's also borough-based taxes.
I see.
So,
And
so it's not
folks, if you're
full.
clicking on the link in the description of this podcast, the Montreal Gazette article actually has a interactive map where you can highlight any of the boroughs included in the greater in Montreal, and you can see the exact change because, for example, in Ile Bizarre Sainte Genevieve, it's going up by 6.3% property tax, but in Côte de Neige Notre Dame de Glace, it's going up only by 1.9%. So that's a pretty wide disparity, to be fair. And it also depends on single family homes, condos, multiplexes, and of course, how big the multiplex is. It could be a small 2 to 5 unit or 6 or more. So there's a bit of complexity here, and I encourage all of you at home to poke through this map, especially if you live in Montreal. It'll be important for you.
Yeah, for sure. And that's, yeah, well said. The way you've described it, I think should be helpful for people. But I think something that there's sort of a perfect storm of things that have happened in Montreal that are exacerbating the housing crisis that exists here and are pouring rocket fuel on it. So about 60% of Montrealers are actually renters.
Hmm.
And so when you have these property tax increases, quite often that gets passed on to the renters. And what's so much worse about what's going on right now is recently the provincial government totally restructured how uh, the rent increases are calculated. So there used to be rather significant rent control in Montreal. I think a lot of activists, myself included, would have criticized heavily what was in place, but at the same time, it was much better relative to other cities in
Yeah,
North
because
America.
over the last few years, my family's from Montreal. I don't me My grandma and Down live here, but we grew up like going there very regularly. They live in Dalo de Olmo, so they're part of the agglomeration, but they're not a borough inside of Montreal anymore. So this isn't relevant to them. But I remember like when meeting my cousins when we go and hang out with their friends who live downtown, like rent being like a fairly affordable thing, like especially compared to like Toronto and Vancouver. I've always understood Montreal to be the cheap city.
Yeah,
Not cheap
well,
as in bad, but like affordable for young people to exist.
for sure, and that's part of why it's such a culturally rich city, why the city is the way it is fundamentally because people had more time. And there's historical examples we can look at, like Red Vienna, where some of the greatest art in the world at the time was coming out of Vienna at a time where they had huge municipal housing projects going on. And rent was typically like 3% of people's income. So, of course, they have time to enjoy their life and make art. And in
3%.
Montreal, it's yeah, in Red Vienna, it's an important historical precedent to look at. And Montreal is nothing like that, but certainly is much cheaper than other North American cities, and that opens the door to all kinds of creative activities that are important for building a good culture. But I think really important and a really important technical change happened where the rent increases used to be legislated by the TAL, the Tribunal Administratif du Logement in Montreal, and they had a number of different categories for how landlords could justify increasing rent, but it was really capped. And the provincial government changed that. So now the rent increase is connected to Quebec's consumer price index, and there's far less regulation. All this to say that landlords in Quebec now can dramatically increase rent relative to what it was before without having to prove their increases the same way they used to in the past. So we're about to see, I think, a real windfall of another round of increasing rents in Montreal if everything plays out the way that it seems it's going to happen. And all of this is happening as there's a crisis of homelessness. Unhoused people in Montreal live in brutal conditions, and the city's response is sort of twofold according to this budget. This article in the Gazette explains that they're going to triple the funding available for fighting homelessness, as they call it. But really, they're just creating more infrastructure to facilitate homelessness. They're not getting at the core of the issue. It's like building a little fence around poison ivy or something. And poison ivy is still going to
Right.
spread around.
With shelters are important in the immediate term, but to solve the problem, you need to be building public housing at scale.
Yeah, and on Ensemble Montréal, this new party, which is effectively a conservative party that's dominated by the landlord class, they've come in and they made it look in this budget like they have the intention of heavily investing in housing in Montreal and affordable housing, social housing, they say. But they've actually clawed back at many of the efforts already made by the previous party. Under the LaPlante government. And so I
Right.
think what we're
Who are
going to
the
see
center-left Projet Montréal.
exactly. And I think what we're going to see is they have, 500 some odd $1 million for the next 10 years to build affordable and social housing, they say. But what does that mean? I think in all likelihood, we're going to see a lot of partnerships with private corporations to develop housing that's maybe 80% or something of a normal rent, but still far too expensive. And
Rather
what we
than just
really need,
building it.
yeah, I
Not
mean,
just directly building state capacity to build homes and then building.
right. I mean, what we need, the model that's proven to work, is cooperative housing, it's social housing, it's non-for-profit housing. And there's no indication that that's what this government is going to do in Montreal. And there's every indication that they are instead just going to line the pockets of wealthy private developers. And they're probably going to build unaffordable, but quote unquote affordable housing around Montreal that's not going to do anything to solve the crises that we face in the city, and that are just going to make people less free and poorer. So it's a really ugly direction things are going here, but that seems to me the most likely direction. And the fallout from the housing problems in particular has such a dramatic impact on our ordinary lives and the way we are able to exist in a city like this. And it's deeply unfortunate, but it's the trend we're seeing across the world right now. I mean, this is just the way urban planning has gone now for quite some time, and it's sad
Well,
to see it hit the city
it's the way
that
it's
I live
gone
in.
in North America.
For sure.
Other continents don't want to be tainted by association with our bad design.
Well, I mean, financialization knows no borders, and anywhere it's able to infect, it's created these kinds of issues. So certainly, I think there are some countries that have, or places, some
Yeah,
cities
but there
that
are
are much more
capitalist cities that
damaged.
have better design than we do. So
Oh, no doubt.
there are capitalists who have taste, believe it or not. uh,
Yes, yeah,
uh,
yeah. I hear what you're saying for
uh,
sure.
one thing I've always been on the idea of co-op housing. That's a model I've always been a little bit suspicious of, just because my on the very basic question of what happens when your neighbors don't like you and want you gone.
Yeah, I think that the reason I have a particular affinity for cooperative housing and the cooperative housing movement is because there's been some extraordinarily successful examples here in Montreal. You have Milton Park, and there's a whole democratic process if your neighbors don't like you. And some cooperatives are far better at actually living those values and actually abiding by the democratic process. There are a lot of ugly politics in cooperative housing, but ultimately, I think it's a far better model than the speculative housing market that's for profit, that's dominated by
Oh
billionaires
yeah,
who own huge parcels of land,
the
etc.
reduction in rent is definitely great. It's just the reason I bring it up is I'm autistic, so as someone with the occasional unfortunate habit of stepping in it, pissing off my neighbors and them having the ability to put me on the street is an unfortunate thing I could have to consider if I lived in co-op housing.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's co-ops out there that would not subject you to that sort of thing. Certainly, I've heard
I
the
hope,
horror
but
stories that clearly
you
you
don't
have.
know
Yeah,
until you're living there.
right.
That's
Yeah,
I think that's why
yeah.
I just prefer like the direct government public housing model. At least then then you just go and yell at your elected official, and it's like, please fix my window so I don't need to yell at you.
Yeah, and I mentioned Red Vienna earlier. I
Yeah.
mean, that was a municipal housing initiative. So it was the municipal government that was
Oh
running
yeah.
the social housing, and
People
it's a
very
model
much
that
underestimate what a city is capable of doing by itself, especially a large one like Montreal. Like
for sure,
yeah,
for sure.
they've got a lot of fiscal resources at their disposal, and it's like I said, I consider these property tax increases pretty modest because compared to Toronto, they are modest, and I also
Mhm.
note like they'll say that the average, like that 3.8% average increase, uh, just across all of the boroughs. Of course, again, it'll depend on your specific borough. But at 3.8 for the average Montreal resident, which is just like a few thousand shy of $800,000, is just an increase of $188 a year. Like
Mhm.
I'm sorry, but I don't actually see that as a very large number at all. Like if you're a homeowner and you can't afford an extra like $188 on your house, like you may not be able to afford having a house.
Yeah, and just keep in
Like what do
mind
you do
again
if
that
like
these,
the furnace breaks? You don't have
yeah, yeah,
$188 to spend on that?
yeah, fair enough. But keep in mind that these property taxes in a renter-heavy city like Montreal get passed off increasingly so to renters. So and the property taxes have increased pretty dramatically. Like where I live last year, they
But
increased
at a
pretty
certain
dramatically.
point, there's not much for them to pass on. They may just be using it as an excuse to raise out of greed and daring you to stop them.
Yeah, yeah, fair enough.
Yeah,
Fair enough.
and like in a competitive market where there's actually good competition in housing, and co-ops and public housing create competition because the private market then needs to compete with that. Like it's harder for there to be just massive increases in rent because it's easier for you to move somewhere else because there's literally more options. Like,
Yeah,
not to
for
get all
sure.
too free marketeer, I am mostly a socialist, but there are some, I do believe in market dynamics to an extent. Like, zoning has to a great degree restricted being able to build things other than single family homes. I think that's part of why Montreal does better as well, because it's been less restricted than Toronto in that regard, where about until recently 90% of residential zoned land could only be a single family home here, not even a
Mm,
duplex.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Montreal's zoning history is very interesting, and there are some very good documentaries out there about its history. I live in the plateau of Montreal, and it's, I think, one of the more livable places to live in North America. And I've really benefited from the way that it's structured. Yeah. Anyway, there's a lot that can be said about Montreal's zoning history. A lot of the zoning laws that were good were stripped away, and it's really transformed parts of the city, like downtown. But the plateau has been, I think, especially livable place because of the way that zoning was done. And I would just lastly say, in terms of like the free market dynamics that you're discussing, I would just add into the mix that, not nonprofit housing is another option that I don't think was clearly stated in this conversation, but it's different than cooperative housing, but has a similar spirit.
Right.
And that's an important part
Technically, they're
of,
both nonprofit, but they're
for
structured
sure.
differently.
Exactly.
There's a lot of
Exactly.
options. Eh,
Yes, yes, yes. And they're an important part of Montreal's housing, and they tend to be actually quite good for the scenarios you describe of people who perhaps don't fit well into the cooperative structure or may not,
if
want
I
to live in
hate
that structure.
having to deal with a homeowners association, I would probably also hate dealing with the other people in the co-op.
Yeah, I think fundamentally we just need to take as much housing off the speculative market as we can,
Give
and that'll
people
get us a long
options.
way in the right direction.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, all right. Well, that has been a very fun discussion. Jason, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It has been an absolute pleasure to have you on. And hopefully we might have you back on again soon later in the year.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks so much, Jake. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Alrighty, everybody. That is Jason Toney, the Director of Media Advocacy, running the Media Accountability Project at Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, and the co-editor of When Genocide Wasn't News, published by The Breach Media. And that'll do it for this week's episode. Thanks once again to Jason Toney for joining the program. Pleasure to have him on. If you're interested in Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, or if you're interested in the NDP leadership contest, they will be holding a debate online on January 21st from 7 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time between 4 of the 5 candidates so far, and there is an Eventbrite link in the podcast description if you are interested in reserving a spot. Thank you very much, folks. We'll have another amazing guest for you next week, and I hope you all have an excellent rest of your day. Cheers. This is the end of the show. Bye.